Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the WFH webinar today. We're going to be talking about the updated prevalence and prevalence at birth estimates for hemophilia. This is a paper that was published 2 weeks ago in the journals of internal medicine. And our speakers today are Dr. Alfonso Iorio, who will be leading the conversation, and Jeff Stonebreaker. So I'd like to introduce you to Alfonso, who will be leading the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Donna, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to comment on this paper that we think was an important goal to achieve. Our goal was indeed to come up with the most accurate possible estimate of how many hemophilia patients are out there. Something that was never done following a very robust scientific approach as we did. In a nutshell, we started our journey in assessing this number from existing established hemophilia registry at the national level. And you see on the left-hand side that we used Australia, Canada, France, Italy, New Zealand, and UK. And that is to assess how many patients are expected to be on Earth. We also went one step forward and we assessed how many patients are expected to be there at birth, which is, as you'll see later on in this presentation, a very important piece of information. For making this assessment, we use a subset of registries, the ones that have been around for longer, Canada, France, and United Kingdom. And then, building on these two numbers, we went on to assess the global number of hemophilia patients we can expect to have. Now, we'll take this process a little bit at a time, and we'll start from terminology. So we have redefined 4 numbers: prevalence, prevalence at birth, expected number of male individuals with hemophilia, and life expectancy disadvantage. Prevalence. What do we mean by prevalence? The definition of prevalence is the total number of identified cases of a disease, in this case hemophilia, in a population divided by the total number of males, because it's a sex-transmitted disease, in that population. So 1 patient in 100 males would be a prevalence of 1%. What did we find? This table is directly out of the paper. The prevalence of all severities of hemophilia A is 17 out of 100,000 males. For hemophilia B is 4 out of 100,000 males. If you sum these two numbers up, the prevalence of hemophilia A or B is 21 cases per 100,000 males, meaning 210 in a million, 21 in 100,000, or 1 in 5,000 males. That's for all severities of hemophilia. If we narrow down to severe disease only, and I'll point out you to the fact that this prevalence was not defined in the past. If you look at severe, then the numbers are 7 per 100,000 males for hemophilia A and 1 for hemophilia B. Now, if you compare with the previous estimate, these numbers are higher. For hemophilia A, we were used to say 10, for hemophilia B, 3. And now we are at 17 and 4. And also this table shows you that we have filled a gap in defining the prevalence of hemophilia A and B severe. Now, where the previous number came from, they were out of one single registry in US, was the CDC data collection, and we knew that that was not covering the entire US population. Where do the numbers that we use in 2019 come from? They come, as I told you before, from 6 established registries: Australia, Canada, France, Italy, New Zealand, and UK. And the last years of data collection for these registries are really approaching the 100% of the population. We have found no heterogeneity when we have meta-analyzed these data across registries for severe hemophilia. There is heterogeneity for mild hemophilia, which reflects the higher difficulty in diagnosing, reaching, and recording in registries mild patients. But for severe, there's really no difference in the statistics of the prevalence across those registries. We are very convinced these are robust numbers. Now, what is prevalence at birth? Prevalence at birth is the number of male babies born with hemophilia among all males born in the population over a period of time. Hemophilia is a congenital disease, so there is really no application for the concept of incidence. Incidence would be the number of new cases in the population over a period of time. There are, 1 million new cases of flu in the 2019 winter in US. There's no such a thing as incidence for hemophilia. The closest concept is prevalence at birth. How many newborns come to Earth with the disease among the denominator, all males born in the same period. This number was not known before. We have estimated it out of the 3 most established registries, and the way we have done it was to go back looking at patients by their year of birth. No matter when they were registered in the registry, we count them back for the year where they were born. And year after year, we had all those born in that year, and we took statistical general demographics number as a denominator. Now, what the prevalence at birth is for across hemophilia A and B is 30 per 100,000 male live birth. And for severe is 11. You see in the plot and in the paper the numbers for A and B, and you can, even without comparing, you can recall that the prevalence was lower than the prevalence at birth. And you'll realize later why this difference is important. So 30 newborns are born with hemophilia every 100,000 male newborn, 11 with severe flavor of disease. So this comes out of the 3 largest and long-lasting registries. If you think in terms of 1 out of how many, is 1 every 3,333, if you want to be precise, newborn. Now, this is a recap of what we have seen up to now. The prevalence in 2019 is 21, 1 in 5,000. The prevalence at birth is 30, 1 in 3,300. And you see there's a gap. Now, what about calculating how many patients we do expect on Earth? We have done some simple math starting from what we know. What we know is the best estimate of how many patients with hemophilia are known worldwide is the annual global survey that WFH produces. And in 2017, this number was little short of 200,000. Now, if we instead apply the prevalence as it is calculated in our paper out of countries where all patients are virtually reached, diagnosed, and registered, you would get that out of 3.8 billion males on Earth, you would have short of 800,000 patients, which is almost double than the 400,000 we were assuming based on previous estimate. And even further, if we calculate how many patients one would expect to have around if everyone born with hemophilia had the same chance of growing old as the non-hemophilia patient, which is 1,300,000. If you put that number over the 3.8 billion males, and you assume that no matter which country you are born, you have the same chance of growing older and as old as the reference population, you would have then 1,125,000 hemophilia patients. And this is where, from the 400,000 previous estimate, we have moved up 3 times. This is what was picked by most headlines about this paper, the 3-time increase in the expected number of hemophilia patients around. We have not counted patients. We have counted patients in a few countries, projected the number worldwide, and this is the expectation. Now, again, this is a summary that explain you where the 800,000 come from and where the 1,125,000 come from. And the previous estimate is there, and the current estimate is in red. That's what gives the 3-time increase in our current estimate. I'm sure there will be questions later on. I'll sit through the end covering the last concept. Actually, for the last concept, which is indeed the most relevant out of this paper, I'll call up to action Jeff.
So this is the last term that we're going to talk about tonight, called life expectancy disadvantage. And we define that as if the prevalence at birth is greater than its prevalence, then people are either cured or die from disease. For hemophilia, it's due to death, and there is a life expectancy disadvantage because people die earlier than the normal population. And a lot of epidemiologists call this excess mortality. And so the next chart is the formula that we use, and we'll give you some numbers, and I actually have additional numbers too to share with you that are contained in the paper. So the life expectancy disadvantage is 1 divided by the ratio of prevalence divided by the prevalence at birth. So some of the numbers that Alfonso mentioned was there's 21 per 100,000 for prevalence of hemophilia A and B, and the number was 30 for prevalence at birth for hemophilia A and B. So if you look at this formula, you know that 1 minus 21 divided by 30 is 30%. So that's a disadvantage, and this is in the countries that we looked at, the high-income countries the 6 of them that we looked at. Some of the other numbers include for hemophilia A, since there's more hemophilia A, that dominates hemophilia B. That's why it's 30% as well. And you can see for severe hemophilia A, it's 37%, 24%, and then 27% for hemophilia B. So it shows you if people in these different categories, for example, the severe hemophiliac, if they died at the same mortality rate, if they had the same mortality rate as the general population, then the prevalence at birth there would be no disadvantage. So you'd have the same number in the numerator and the denominator. So you would have 30 divided by 30, which is 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0. So it'd be no disadvantage. So it's a little hard concept. It's kind of almost opposite that you would expect. When we looked at in the paper, we actually looked at other income levels. So we looked at the life expectancy disadvantage in other income levels. So we looked at our prevalence papers back in hemophilia in 2010 and for hemophilia A, and in 2012 for hemophilia B. And the disadvantage for the upper middle income, this is based on the World Bank's definition, was 64%. So you always have to realize that a bigger number is worse because it shows there's more disadvantage. So that was for the upper middle. When you look at lower middle, it's 77%. So once again, the number's getting worse. And then when you look at the low income countries, it's 93%. So there's a big disadvantage. So what that would be is if the prevalence was 30 and the number would be probably like 3. So 3 divided by 30. So 3 in a country, a low-income country, and then 30 prevalence at birth, that would be 3 divided by 30 is 1/10. So that would be 90% disadvantage. The beauty of this formula actually is you can compare your disadvantage and where you are each individual country, because you can look at your country and look at what is your prevalence numbers, how many people have this disease at a certain point in time, and then how many people are born with it, and you can compare those two numbers and find out where you're at. So it actually extends beyond just what we're looking at here. So I think that's a very powerful information that you can use and learn upon. I see we have some questions, so we only have a couple more slides, and these slides, the last few are, and we're going to go through these rather quickly. They are meant to just kind of break the ice in terms of questions. What makes a study unique? The analysis is across these, for prevalence at birth, is across the 3 most established, longest living registries from Canada, France, and the United Kingdom. And it's really the first time that we looked at severe patients, and that really is probably the most important thing, is what do your severe patients look like in terms of the prevalence at birth versus the prevalence? What's the disadvantage in terms of severity in your country? And you can look at the regions, different countries around you economically, and just who your neighbor is, and you can do a lot of comparisons. So, like I said, it's a very powerful formula, the life expectancy disadvantage. The next slide talks about why is this important? Well, I think it's important for many reasons, but for the World Bleeding Disorders Registry and the annual global survey that's produced by the World Federation of Hemophilia, it kind of sets a foundation, a baseline. So now we can compare where we are today and where we're going to be as time goes on, how much we're improving, and how close are we getting towards treatment for all. So I think it's extremely important. It kind of, like I said, it kind of puts a line in the sand and says, okay, we need to do better. And it gives us a starting point. It's a good foundation. And I believe the last slide that we have in terms of questions is, how does this impact our community? And I alluded to this already. It affects, it's going to affect the availability for new and more effective treatment, which reduces this life expectancy gap, the disadvantage that we talked about earlier. And it should be across all income levels. It allows us to calculate markers for adequate care across the world and be an advocate for equal distribution of resources. And then finally, I think what it allows us to do is it kind of establishes a number that now we can look at what is the actual burden of the disease for hemophilia. So I think we have some big goals here, but it's no bigger than treatment for all. So we're excited with the work we've done. We think it has huge potential to move our community towards the goal of the WFH. And the last chart actually is the acknowledgement. So we want to acknowledge all the people involved, including the authors in the paper. Hopefully you've had a chance to get the paper. You can contact us if you want to get a copy of the paper. We can send you a link. But the National Patient Registries, without this good data that these folks collect, we wouldn't have what we have. There would be no webinar. And so I think we really got to applaud Australia, Canada, France, Italy, New Zealand, United Kingdom for their registries and where they're at. And we definitely encourage other registries. I mean, at some point you can see we'd like to have more and more registries involved, and we are just touching the tip of the iceberg with what we can do if we have good data, and that's part of our committee, the Data Demographics Committee. So we thank all the members of that, and also the advisory board, who has been instrumental in really encouraging us to move forward with this really important project. So at this time, I think the really truly last slide is we want to thank you for your questions that are coming up, and I think we have quite a few, so we can go ahead and maybe just look through these. Alfonso, do you want to read them, and then we can address those?
Okay, so thank you, Jeff, and let me join Jeff in thanking the WFH for supporting the webinar, but even more so supporting this work. I think it's fair to say that this is in our opinion, this is an important milestone in the history of hemophilia care, and I would say that having a paper like this published in a general journal like Annals of Internal Medicine, beyond the usual reach of the hemophilia community, is a testament of the robustness of the approach and the relevance of the data. But I think we should be reminding ourselves that the idea of exploring these was conceived in the Data and Demographics Committee of WFH, and I and Jeff and others have been discussing for long how to approach this problem, and it has been a long journey, and we would have not gotten access to the data and being able to do the work if it was not through WFH. So I want to join in saying that. Now, moving to the question, the first one is from Alan, and it says, if non-severe PWH are underdiagnosed and underrecorded, would the prevalence estimated be weighted up? The missing diagnosis of non-severe leads to underestimate the overall prevalence of the disease. And this is why we have kept the estimate of the mild and the estimate of the severe apart. Severe is diagnosed more easily and sooner, and a mild form of disease may take longer, may take several years for being recognized. Now, in countries like the one that contributed data for this exercise, that reach to the mild happens. There is a delay, so you see that the number grows and continues to grow. If you look at 1 year birth, continues to grow for 4, 5 years, 7 years after birth, before the patient is captured in the database. So the question is very important. We have to be careful in projecting this number, but the way we have calculated this number out of this registry should be resistant to the underestimation related to the more difficult diagnosis of mild. And Alan, if I didn't get your question or didn't answer it fully, you are welcome to try again. My fault if I didn't get it properly. I don't know, Jeff, if you want to comment at all on this question.
Sure, I'll add a little bit. I think the power of this analysis is we did break it up by severe and all severities. So I think that's powerful. I think severes, we have really a good handle on the prevalence numbers for that. The other thing that we did, and Alfonso said this, I'm just going to restate it, is the prevalence at birth, the calculations, we have data, actually have data like in the 1800s of people being born. For some of these registries, they have people born in like 1800s of people that had developed, that had hemophilia. We looked at from 1991 to 2015, and then we soon recognized, like Alfonso said, that there was a big drop-off and people weren't being diagnosed. So we actually took into account the 5-year delay, time lag, and only analyzed the prevalence at birth from 1991 to 2010. So we took off 5 years, and we did some sensitivity analysis as well. So I think it's a very good question, and hopefully we, like Alfonso said, hopefully we answered your question. Thank you, Port.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. The second question is from Daniel Levin, and the question is, do we think that some of the registries like UK or France are artificially high because of patients from less developed countries migrating for the purpose of treatment? We have asked that question ourselves early in this process, and to be fully transparent, there were a couple of other registries that we considered initially, and we had to not to use because they were generating heterogeneity in pooling. We try not to be technical on this webinar, but we have done quite a serious work, prompted also by the reviewers at Annals of Internal Medicine, making sure that we were mixing data that were comparable. And all these 7 registries are comparable. There were registries where very likely something like that or founder effect could have happened. There's a section in the discussion of the paper when we take all the possible explanation for overestimation into account and we discuss them. Now, one point that made us feel the immigration was not a likely confounder is that we didn't take numbers out of one single year, particularly for the prevalence at birth. We had checked the number over and over and over using a statistical technique that Jeff may be able to speak to, a sort of steady state analysis or a cumulative incidence analysis, and you would be surprised how flat that number is. So assuming immigration plays a role, you would assume that this is a flat phenomenon where a constant number of patients gets in every year without any variation over time, which is of course possible, but very unlikely. So we think there shouldn't be a huge effect of this phenomenon. And again, Jeff, not sure if you want to chime in on this aspect.
Yeah, just a real short point. This paper is actually a supplement that Alfonso was alluding to. It's the steady state cumulative look at the prevalence at birth. So you can look at that for the 3 countries that we looked at, and then we have data for the other countries as well. So it just gives you more of the data, and you can look at that. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a over 100 pages supplements and tables, and it gives you a lot of details about how we got to feel that this number were stable. Now, the following question, I think I will leave directly to Jeff, and he's from Hill, and he says, what was the rationale for not including data from the U.S. registries for the current WFH update? Now, being Jeff based in U.S., maybe he can give a first crack to this question.
Sure. The seminal work of Mike Susi back in 1998, the occurrence of hemophilia in the United States, was based on 6 states in the United States, and he did a comprehensive look at it. And like I said, that's a seminal paper, referenced, cited lots of times, probably 1,000 times, I'm guessing. And in that paper, and talking with Mike, and then subsequent paper, I think there's a paper by Baker as well from the U.S. and a member on our team, our data demographics team as well. There's a lack of counting patients, so we haven't counted all patients, and it's roughly they're capturing about 70%. And rather than using that factor, we decided let's just not include it. I think it warrants a further analysis and probably paper on looking a little bit more at the U.S. You have the CDC, you have the Athena group, and others that have data, and the HTCs, and so it seems like there's a lot of different sources, and somehow we ought to call those together and come up with a good number. But I think you raise a good point. And being from the U.S., I'd like to have I'd like to see things tightened up and maybe include in another paper. But that's the reason we didn't include it, because both Mike's paper and this paper by Baker, I think 2010, I don't have the reference in front of me, they both said, we're capturing about 70% of the patients. So that's why we didn't include it.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'll add one little piece of detail. The following question is any reason not to extrapolate this number to the U.S.? So I'll take this question while I add a comment on the previous one. Absolutely not. I think this data should be extrapolated to the U.S., and you may get numbers that are higher than those you can read in the existing registries, which would point to some patient in the U.S. for many reasons, and we can speculate, might not be captured by registries. I also want to point you out, if you are interested in this specific topic, to a paper published on hemophilia 3 years back from the Indiana Hemophilia Treatment Center, and where there is a single center in a state. They essentially cover the population, and the figures they get there are very, very close to the one we got from non-American sources. So we think these numbers do apply to US. Unfortunately, we couldn't generate them using US-based data, but they would definitely apply to US.
Let me elaborate a little bit more on that too, Andrew, to your question. The number from Mike's paper, his 1998 paper, was 13.4. You saw this on our slide deck as well, 13.4 per 100,000 males, the prevalence of hemophilia A and B. If you look at this paper, he also looks at the prevalence at birth, and that is the 1 out of 5,000 number, which if you do the math for that, that's 20. So you can see 13.4 at the 20, there's a discrepancy there. Now, is it a life expectancy disadvantage? There is some of that because we had HIV and hepatitis, so there is some of that going on, but it's also what we were just talking about, not doing a full counting of all people with hemophilia.
Okay, thanks. Moving on, there's a question from David Page. Does lower prevalence because of death in a particular country result in lower prevalence at birth because of fewer males transmitting the disease? Now, it can be where the mortality is so early that impact on fertility and the chance of transmitting. We have to be mindful that 1/3 of cases of hemophilia is spontaneous 22 and 1 inversion, so those would not be affected. And the other one is that may well be that conceiving at late age may actually even increase the chance of having a son with hemophilia. So yes, this is a potential. Again, it would affect the goodness of this number when used to estimate the population in countries where there is no access to treatment. For the countries we've used, this should not be a problem. So again, the number should be robust. When you apply them to countries where life expectancy was cutting into the fertile period of life, you might expect even lower number than the one that you would calculate. So good point, David. Jeff, I don't know if you want to add on this one.
I could pull the I'm not from Canada card and just let your answer stand. I think I'll do that.
So thanks. Then we have a question from my apologies if I don't pronounce it properly, Mutiza or Moketti. And the question is, so is this new study going to be approved and used at the WFH prevalence going forward? I'll give you back the favor, Jeff, because I'm past chair of the D&D. So what the D&D will do is actually on you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think part of why we started this process and why the Medical Advisory Board and the powers that be of the World Federation of Hemophilia, they wanted us to update the numbers. So I think this will be approved as the new numbers. There'll be a white paper. I guess we don't need a white paper. We have a paper. So that I think that'll be the new standard going forward.
Okay. Another question from Canada, Michael Long. Rare diseases are generally defined in Europe anyways as prevalence no more than 5 in 10,000 people. Accordingly to your finding, we are at about 3 in 10,000 people at birth, so still a rare disease. Can you extrapolate for VWD and what the prevalence might be globally? This info could be useful in terms of advocacy. So I cut short on this second. I don't think we can extrapolate to VWD. I mean, it may apply, it may not. It really depends on how easy is for this patient to get to get diagnosed and recognized. So it is very difficult to extrapolate. There's another question about can this approach be used for other rare diseases, and it definitely can, and we hope that we have pointed the way. But the extrapolation requires to have validated and robust comprehensive registries. So It would apply to every rare disease that is genetically transmitted, no big founder effect, no variation among different ethnicities and so on. But even then, you would need to have a registry to base the calculation on. That's the answer to your second question. For what is still fitting the definition of rare disease, yes, we checked that when we were doing the calculation. It does still fit the definition of EMA or European Community, as you are pointing out. It also fits the definition of the FDA, because we have done the projection on US, and you don't cross the 200,000 number of affected individuals that would make the disease not rare in US. So we think this doesn't change the nature of hemophilia to be a common disease. It shows that hemophilia is more common than we thought, still a rare disease. I'll carry on. So Daniel Lidl asked a question about, are there plans to include females with hemophilia and carriers in the future? There was no plan to exclude them. The reason we used males is because the disease is overwhelmingly more common in males. And so numbers were barely sufficient in hemophilia B to have stable estimates, even for males. Females, it's not that we were not interested in, but there are less individuals of female sex having a clinically open disease. And the other difference is that in males, you have a gene mutation, and you have a factor level, and you have a phenotype, a corresponding phenotype. And we didn't have any access, neither we wanted, to bleeds or penetrance of the disease. When it comes to female, you have that additional confounding factor. It's not just a matter of factor levels. If we wanted to extrapolate to women with less than 1% factor rate, we could have done it. But very, very, very low number, very, very, very wide confidence intervals. Then counting what make a individual with higher factor level still be a severe, phenotypically severe patient adds a component of judgment and clinical assessment that was beyond an epidemiological study. So there are plans to continue care for hemophilia female and carriers. There's no plan of replicating this study on that population, at least not that I'm aware of. I don't know if you, Jeff, have this card in your sleeve, but
I think the WFH is interested in what you're asking, and they've published some works on females, and they have, if you go on their website, they have information on it as well, some analysis. So I think it's on people's mind, and that includes all bleeding disorders. I know we got some questions about that, so I think that's all part of what we're trying to do, and hopefully this will be a template for other areas that we can look at. This is from Gretchen Chu. And did you consider possible differences in prevalence at birth in Asia countries, or confirm that the rate is relatively consistent across all of the races in your registries?
Well, we didn't have any registry from Asian countries, and so the short answer is no. We would love to do so, but we didn't have access to any data specifically collecting prevalence and number of patients in Asian countries.
If you go back to Mike's paper in '98 in the United States, he broke it up by races, and it was pretty consistent. So there was consistency between race, ethnicity, and I mean it says United States. So I think I guess just to piggyback what Alfonso said, we would both love the opportunity to look at data from other countries. I think that's how and work with whoever wants to work with us. I think it's just an opportunity. The more that we showcase what you can do with data, the more people will be willing to collect the data. So I think it's hugely important to get more look at more as opposed to less. So I would say yes, if we can get access and willing to work with us, we're in the game. We want to play.
What you'll find in the discussion of the paper, if you take the time reading it, is that we address some of the genetical background for expecting or not expecting, in this case, a variation of prevalence at birth with ethnicity. And all the studies that address factor 8 and factor 9 biology and evolutionary biology shows that these were very, very strongly conserved portion of the genome, not only in human beings, but even before across species. And there are not so many important polymorphism around. So the expectation is not to have a difference based on race, but again, something is the expectation and something would be having data to confirm it. The same would apply to the question from Maher, do we have any data from countries in the Middle East? We actually don't, and we would recommend to consider these data. What may apply to some specific cultural setting is that wherever consanguineous marriages are a practice or habit, you might have an impact on prevalence and prevalence at birth, similarly to what a founder effect would do. In those cases, our estimate would be conservative. So we would not obtain that in any X country where we expect to have more hemophilia patients because of inbred, because of consanguineous marriages, we would have less patients that we predict. In case we would have more, so it would still be safe to use our number, and that would apply to both the Middle East, Asia, and so on. And I think that this is also discussed in the limitation of the paper, saying that we acknowledge that we don't know, but there's no real reason why this should not work in those settings.
Can I piggyback a little bit on what you said? We do have data from Middle East countries. The annual global survey that the WFH goes out and collects data from the NMOs. We collect data, but it's higher level than what we're looking for, and we can't. The data does not provide prevalence at birth. We don't know patients by birth year. So if we can go that next level of data, we could do a lot more and look at it. So I think we do have data, but it's not at the level that we need.
Right, and let me spend a minute to comment on how you can use the data, because we have tried to make the point, but maybe I'll try once more. So these data were generated out of these 6 registry and 3 registry for prevalence at birth. We think they are valuable worldwide. We have made the example of US, can be the same in the Gulf area in Asia. So one point is wherever there are established registries that are as good as the one we used, we can use those registries to explore if there is an ethical variation, if numbers are the same in Thailand or in India, and whatever. That's one use of this data. We have established a solid, rock-solid number. We can check how it compares to other settings where there are established registries. Wherever registries are not there, wherever, let's say, the only source of data is the AGS, we can still use this data to help local advocacy by looking at, we would expect to have 10 patients, instead we have 2. We need to work on finding the other 8. So if the measured prevalence, the one known in that country, are less than the one that should be known there, we know that there is a diagnostic problem, or patients are not reported to the registries. Then we can go one step forward and saying, you have 10 severe patients, as you would expect, but you have only 3 mild patients. And indeed, you would have, using the data from the Annals publication, you would be expected to have 11 mild patients. So maybe you are good at diagnosing severe, you are good at capturing them in the registry, you still have to improve and reach out to the mild. So this is a second indicator of quality of care. Having all the patients that are expected, having the same or a similar number of mild, not only severe. And a third approach is saying, okay, what's the age distribution of your hemophilia population? And Jeff showed you the life disadvantage. So if you have the same number of pediatric patients, but you have many less adults, that means that there's still space to improve care in that country because you are able to do the diagnosis, you reach them all, both severe and mild, but you can't provide care enough to make them grow old as it would be in UK or in Canada or in France. So this number would apply anyways to all countries, no matter if there is a registry that can be comparable. We might not learn about prevalence and incidence in the Gulf area or in China. We would still be able to use this number to lobby for better care, which was one of the most important objectives we wanted to reach. I'll raise another question, and then we may need to, well, we have still 10 minutes. So let me, first of all, Jeff, you want to comment on anything of what I said right now on the measure of indicator of quality of care?
No, I think you've covered it. You did a good job.
Good, because maybe instead you will need to provide more detail to the next question. The next question says, were there much variance in prevalence and prevalence at birth, respectively, between countries analyzed in the study? So again, we wanted to keep this webinar to the bone, and we wanted to focus on the basic message. The paper has gone through a very detailed statistical review, and there are confidence intervals around every single number. So your answer is in how wide those confidence intervals are, and are really not. So there was not a huge variation. We have also done a formal meta-analysis, meaning we have not just summed up cases across registry. We have calculated this number first for each of the registry, and then we have compared how similar they were, and only when we found that were similar enough, we have pooled them. So the brief answer to your question is no. For prevalence at birth, there is essentially minimal variation between Canada, UK, and France, which is what makes us feel that those numbers are real. And there is also minimal variation over time. If you cut off the first few years of life of a registry and the last 5 years where you may still have noise by it take longer or shorter to get patient into the registry, but the core part of the years for over 10, 12 years in each of the countries, the number stays the same. It does not vary if you look at the cumulative. If you look at the newborn every year, it varies a lot, small numbers. So 1 year in Canada, we can have 12 new one, and the year after we can have 24. But on average, we have a very precise number of newborn with hemophilia A, which is around 20, which is where our numbers are coming from. There is a bit more variability for mild, which is expected because even in the Western world, the capacity of capturing mild, or the willingness, let me say, of capturing mild may vary system to system. So not huge variability measured, reported in the paper. There's a question by Richard saying why other Western European countries like Spain or Germany were not included in the study. So there are two possible explanations. One is that we have been missing the existence of established registries in those countries, and we would apologize if that's the case, but as far as we know, there is no such a thing as a national registry in Spain, and for sure there is no such a thing as a national registry in Germany. So we did not include any country where there was no established registry. And I understand that these may come through little sharp, but I think as well as Jeff was very thankful to the countries having put time, resources, and effort in curating registries for over 15 years, I think that this paper should come through as a stimulus for other countries to build their own national registries and being able to catch up on generation of data. For Africa, the last question I have on the list from Rotimi, Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a registry I know of in South Africa, and I know of because I was involved in some of the work to set it up, but is not yet mature for this kind of use. And to my knowledge, the best source of data for those countries is still the AGS, which capture what is reported to centers and to patient organizations. So no source data from Africa. Hopefully, our new estimate will help speeding up uptake of care and lobbying, particularly in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa. So not yet. Let's answer that way. I have a couple more things popping up quickly. One is from Richard. Have been this figure matched with the PEDNet? The PEDNet is a different framework. It collects. It tends to collect all PUPs out of a few centers. There's no such a thing as the denominator for those centers. This paper is built on matching new and existing cases of hemophilia against the underlying population. The underlying population for the PEDNet registry can't be calculated because only some of the centers in some country participate. So there's no way of matching. Cesar Garrido asked, does this study only establish this change for hemophilia or can be thought to all bleeding disorder? The method could apply. Again, I think I answered for von Willebrand, would be the same for other bleeding disorders, provided there's a robust registry that is reaching most, if not all, the patient. You can apply the same method. Unfortunately, the registry science reality is behind for other aspects. For how much I like Prasad, I don't think I can summarize my finding in 1 minute, so I'm afraid I'll send you the link for the paper and you have to read it, Prasad. We can discuss later. Limitation of the study. Again, we touch upon them, addressing some of the questions, and they are discussed. We assume that the prevalence of hemophilia is the same across different ethnic group. We assume that movement of patients across country borders is influential, and we assume that the criteria for diagnosis are the same. Sharing the slides, ask research at WFH, no reason not to. And I don't think I'm missing any more. All the other are people thanking. And you are most welcome. There's no point in doing research if not having people interested in the results. So we are really flattered by you joining and asking questions. We are not allowed to post the paper as is. The paper, of course, is the copyright is with Annals of Internal Medicine. The paper will become free access in 6 months. That's the policy for Annals. But until then, if you are individually interested in reading the full paper or in reading the appendices, we are allowed to provide you a link for personal use. And again, you can ask Donna or ask at the WFH address that is on screen, and we will be pleased providing you a link for your own personal copy. And I think that with these, I'll thank again WFH for setting these webinar up, Joe for the technical support, every one of you for joining and for flurry of very interesting questions. Feel free to download and disseminate these webinars further on. Thank you very much, everyone.
I just want to thank everybody for joining. Thank Alfonso and Jeff for this great presentation. I think it was really clearly laid out. And any further questions can be addressed to research@wfh.org, and we can send them off to Jeff and Alfonso.